Who's producing our webinar tonight, and the entire alumni engagement staff. I want to welcome you to the Virtual Alumni College. This is a year-long series of webinars led by faculty, giving alumni an opportunity to encounter the kind of discourse that our students regularly enjoy on campus. Our topic tonight is one that has captured the entire world's attention over the last few days and months, and the title of the session tonight is ISIS and the Pathology of Politics in the Middle East. It's led by Dr. Jeffrey Kenney, Professor of Religious Studies at DePaul. Dr. Kenney earned his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara. His research focuses on Islam in modern Egypt, with a special interest in Islamist movements, political violence, and religion-state relations. His areas of teaching responsibility include comparative courses in the study of religion, such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Introduction to Religions, and Religion and Politics, as well as more specialized courses in the Islamic tradition, such as Classical Islam, Islam and Modernity, and Women in Islam. Dr. Kenney's presentation tonight will focus on the emergence of ISIS and explore the political cohesion of nation-states in the Middle East, Western foreign policy in the region and the broader Muslim world, the volatility of global Muslim identity, and the ability of jihadist groups to capitalize on the failures, both real and perceived, of modernity. Dr. Kenney will begin with about 45 minutes of presentation and then take questions. Actually is going to take questions throughout. We'll have probably a discussion period after, but if you have a question at any point during the presentation, you can use the Google form document. I believe there will be a link through the live stream page that you can, through which you can submit your question. I'll read that off to Dr. Kenney, so we hope to keep this very interactive as we go. So at this time, it's my
audience too.
I'm sorry?
For the live audience.
Yes,
too.
and we'll take questions from the live audience as well that has bared and braved the sub-zero Arctic temperatures here in Greencastle for this important discussion. So at this point, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Kenney and thank him for being with us tonight.
Thank you, sir. Steve, do you want to... I'm going to use a remote mic, which I hope is being picked up because I don't like to stay stationary. My understanding is that the virtual audience can see the PowerPoint slides. The live audience, unfortunately, is going to have a bit of a glare, but maybe we can work our way around that. Let me just start by thanking Steve Setchell for inviting me to come out on a cold night like this to do something that I would not normally be doing at 8 o'clock at night. And thank you to the people who have actually shown up in physical form. I'm dealing with a bit of a cold, or the aftermath of it, which means that my throat is going to get dry and parched and a little bit froggy. So every once in a while, I'm going to be reaching for my warm tea. I like to imagine that the virtual audience is probably reaching for a different beverage, one that I would probably prefer to be drinking tonight, but I'm here instead. I'd like to start with a bit of a qualification about my approach. Most people who have been writing about ISIS for the last year or so are primarily people dealing with international policy, international politics, not a lot of people who focus on the study of religion. I have been studying in the Middle East and traveling back and forth for the last, well, ever since early part of the 1980s. And probably like all of you, I have been somewhat mesmerized by what is happening there. And perhaps also like many of you, I've been confused. But I have a particular kind of set of parameters that I'm viewing it within, and it's a little bit different probably than a lot of the commentary pieces that you might see in the newspapers. And that's going to kind of guide it, what I'm going to present tonight. But what I'd like to do is start with a piece, a quote from a passage of an article that appeared in Politico magazine back in September, written by Hisham Melhem, who is the Washington bureau chief of Al Arabiya. This piece is called "The Barbarians Within Our Gates," and the second paragraph, which I'm going to take the time to read, to me captures emotionally what I hope to be able to capture in a kind of PowerPoint slide presentation over the next 45 minutes or so. This is the way the quote starts. "Arab civilization, such as we knew it, is all but gone. The Arab world today is more violent, unstable, fragmented, and driven by extremism, the extremism of the rulers and those in the opposition, than at any time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire a century ago. Every hope of modern Arab history has been betrayed. The promise of political empowerment, the return of politics, the restoration of human dignity heralded by the season of Arab uprisings in their early heydays has all given way to civil wars, ethnic sectarianism, and regional subdivisions, and the reassertion of absolutism, both in its military and atavistic forms. With the dubious exception of the antiquated monarchies of the Emirates of the Gulf, which for the moment are holding out against the tide of chaos, and possibly Tunisia, there is no recognizable legitimacy left in the Arab world." End quote. I find this to be an intriguing comment. I mean, it's incredibly bleak. By the way, it's not one that you would typically read in Arabic in the Muslim world. This is something, I'm not going to say it's for a Western audience, but it certainly appeals to them quite a bit. But with that said, I think the barbarism part captures what most of us have been witnessing since the summer especially, but even perhaps a bit before there. And what I'd like to do is try to capture, at least in a couple of images, some of the things that we have been watching. The kind of march with the black banners, which signified originally Al-Qaeda, but now it's been taken over by ISIS. The transport trucks carrying soldiers, ISIS soldiers, or now called IS soldiers. Interestingly enough, many of the vehicles and much of the armament that is now being used was stolen from the Iraqi army, which is to say it's American-made. The other thing, of course, that has drawn everyone's attention, and purposefully so, is the kind of horrific brutality, the rounding up especially of Shia and Christians and others, and their brutal killings. This has all been captured and videotaped and sent out, often in Twitter feeds and things like this, in order to gain a broad following. And then, of course, what we have seen most recently is the assassination of the 2 Japanese citizens, and then it's hard to even imagine, the caged Jordanian air pilot who was burned alive. Most recently, the beheading of a series of Christian Coptic Egyptians who were taken prisoner in Libya and were essentially executed by one of the new provinces of ISIS or IS that's in Libya. It's hard to believe. And it's almost as if every day one wakes up and waits to see something else happening. In the background to a lot of this is this image of the gentleman known as al-Baghdadi, who has declared himself over the summer to be Amir al-Mu'mineen, which is the commander of the faithful, a man who has claimed to be able to have reasserted and restarted up the Caliphate. He's donned the gown, he has stood in the podium as many caliphs before have done, and tried to symbolize this return to a kind of system of rule which is very, very ancient, gets its start in 632. But in fact, what I would like to argue is that despite the images and despite the kind of harking back in the symbolism to a much, much earlier time in history, what we're dealing with is a movement that has 2 very modern interconnected drivers or causes. First is the ongoing, I guess I could say myth, or maybe I should say it's an idea, but it's an ongoing idea of an alternative political modernity informed by Islam, which most people would call Islamism. This idea has in some ways mutated to global jihadism. I will get to that in a little bit. But this idea has been alive since the early part of the 20th century, and it has not gone away primarily because there have been no mechanisms for Muslims in the Middle East, and I would say in many other parts of the world, to move beyond an ideal or a myth to try to institutionalize it in reality. The other driver, and again it's interconnected with this, is the failure of Arab nation states to create inclusive, economically viable polities. Despite the great heyday of Arab nationalism back in the 1940s and 50s when Arab nations were created, and the idea that nationalism, and actually a secular nationalism, would take hold and would in fact develop these countries and create a new modern, comparably modern in terms of the West, kind of system of rule and a society and economy. This has not really happened. And at least it's not happened for the vast majority of citizens. But I would like to return to the idea of the caliph, not because we're going to go back to the 7th century, but because I think the notion of the caliphate is something that is still in the minds of Muslims, mainly because, like the myth of Islamism, it's connected up with an ideal, and many Muslims in the Middle East are, I think, holding out the hope of an ideal of social justice, an ideal of equity, an ideal of some kind of economic justice, because it's not there. And in many cases, they turn to Islam for this, whether they are overly pious or not. The actual caliphate, which is an office of the successor of the Prophet of God, was instituted in 632. It was abolished in 1924 with the emergence of the modern state of Turkey. This was after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. It had been collapsing for a very long time, but its final throes came after World War I, when the Ottomans, who had been fighting against the Allies in Europe, were defeated, and the successors, the winners of the battle, as all of you no doubt know, mainly the French and the British, who had already been occupying many countries in the Middle East and colonizing them, took the spoils of the Ottoman Empire and divided it up. This actually started before the end of the empire, before the war, World War I, ended, with the agreement that was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, when both a British and a French statesman, two statesmen, one British, one French, got together and essentially mapped out the contours of what would be the Middle East post-war. This idea was often kept in secret for a period of time anyway, until the war was over. And the wind-up was with this mandate system, where you saw different regions under the control of the French and the British throughout the Middle East. This is only part of what the agreement was. It was later validated by the League of Nations in 1920, which essentially creates these modern states of what we know as Iraq and Syria, Palestine also. What essentially the ISIS has done, and this is something that they have claimed to want to do, is nullify the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and in a sense also nullify the modern politics of the Middle East. What they want to have is a do-over. And by, in some way, tearing down the borders between Syria and Iraq, they are asserting their power, but they're also asserting that essentially modern nation states do not work in the Middle East and that there is no future for them. Now, I want to again return to this idea of the caliphate because while it did end formally in 1924 when the leader of modern Turkey, Ataturk, decided to take modern Turkey in a more secular direction and a more European direction, and getting rid of the caliphate was one of the main elements of this. There was, in fact, in India of all places, a movement that started up even before this in 1919 called the Khilafat, which is another way of pronouncing caliphate, and it's the way the transliteration system was working in India at the time. But this was a movement that was started up by Indian Muslims. This is before the split between India and Pakistan. By Indian Muslims who were trying to put pressure on the British to maintain this political symbol of the Caliphate, which had existed again since the mid part of the 7th century. Now, of course, they were doing this because the British were also occupying India at the time, and they wanted to try to protest. This Caliphate movement in India was actually kind of interesting because it had the support of the Congress Party. Mahatma Gandhi was a supporter of it. They all thought that this was a wise thing to do because the British were involved with so much, taking a part of various countries and reconfiguring them, that they thought this is one thing that they could all latch onto as a symbol that should survive. Interestingly enough, while this was a pan-Muslim movement, it didn't get much play in the Middle East among Arabs. And this is something that perhaps Indian Muslims should have thought of, but they didn't, and that is the fact that Ottomans among Arabs were actually considered to be the colonizers. They were the occupiers of the Arab world, and so in some ways at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was taken apart, this is when the Arabs started to think more in terms of structuring their own nation states, and when nationalism really starts to come alive as a series of movements that would actually lead to independence from the British and from the French and from other colonial powers. So in some ways, first you have to liberate yourself essentially from the Muslim occupiers, the Ottomans, and then you're going to liberate yourself in another way from the foreigners. They were all foreigners, some of them were Turkish, some of them were Ottoman, and others were French or British. So in the Arab world, this never did take off very much. But there is a coincidence, and I would say it's not so much of a coincidence, because the Caliphate movement as a movement, while it dies off, it kind of is reborn in another form in the 1920s with the formation of the Society of Muslim Brothers, who try to promote what comes to be known as Islamism or political Islam, which is the notion that Islam holds within it the answers to modern politics, modern society, modern economies, modern international relations, that Muslims in the Middle East and elsewhere don't need to adopt ideologies from Europe like nationalism, which originates there, but rather they can come up with their own ideas. They don't need to create nation states. They can create their own Islamic state, which of course the people within the Islamist movement regarded as something that would be more totalizing in terms of including Muslims from around the world, not just the Middle East. So in the Islamist movement, which was founded initially by the Society of Muslim Brothers in 1928, just 4 short years after the dissolution of the Caliphate, Hassan al-Banna, the founder, starts to lay out these ideas of creating what is essentially an alternative political modernity within a framework that's already happening in places like Egypt and other places in the Middle East, where Arab Muslims and Arabs in general are trying to figure out what kind of political future they're going to have and how they're going to shape it, and what are the ideas that they're going to use to build this modern political future. Most of these ideas, I have to say, were in fact borrowed from Europe. So many people were borrowing ideas like socialism. Some Arabs and Arab Muslims become communists. So they're adopting a variety of ideologies, many of which they say are compatible with Islam. But they're adopting these things because they think, just like Europe has become the modern wave and modernity rests in Europe, then the answers to modernity rest there also. And if Arabs want to become modern and modern enough in order to get strong enough to put off the West, to stand up to the West, then they need to, in some way, become like Europe also in terms of its political future. Now, what's interesting about this is that Hassan al-Banna knows this field of play that's out there, and he casts the Society of Muslim Brothers as an alternative form that is a kind of an authentic Muslim modern identity, where you don't have to borrow from the West, where you can, in fact, look to your own tradition, your own past, to create a modern political future. Now, of course, when one looks very closely at the ideas of Hassan al-Banna, you can see that he was borrowing very heavily from the current idea of what a modern nation state would look like. And in fact, he's more or less, I would say anyway, painting Islam into a mold of modern nation states. In fact, that's what made Islam so powerful, according to his reading. It had essentially met the same standards and addressed the same issues that a modern nation state would address. But his point is that what he's trying to put forward to his fellow Egyptians and to other Arabs and to other Muslims around the world is that Islam has an answer for political modernity in the Muslim world, and we do not need the West for this. This idea took off quite strongly after 1928. It got very strong in the 30s and 40s. The Muslim Brotherhood managed to gain lots of followers. This was a very dynamic movement. It wasn't just politics. The Muslim Brotherhood created what some regarded as a kind of mini society within Egypt, in which it created philanthropic organizations, it created charities, it provided medical clinics, it provided educational opportunities, job opportunities. It was in some ways trying to mirror the secular state by showing that Islam essentially had the answers, right? And in fact, what became the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood later on was essentially Islam is the answer. And what is it the answer to? Well, it's the answer to everything, right? And whatever the question you have, especially the question of living in a modern world, Islam will provide the answer to this. Now, the brothers by the early part of the 1950s were probably, well, not probably, they were the strongest movement, social movement in Egypt. They had offices and they had clubs and associations throughout the country. The numbers are somewhat hazy here. We don't have a lot of really solid numbers, but some people estimate that up to 500,000 people were in some way either members or very close affiliates of the organization. The problem here is that actually by the time that Egypt has its revolution in 1952, and the person who comes to power, Gamal Abdel Nasser, winds up adopting a kind of Arab socialism as an ideology to drive the country, and this ideology stands in stark contrast to the Islamism that Hassan al-Banna and other Islamists were posing. The other problem, and here we're getting to the other part of the two-part drivers, is that what happens in Egypt and happens in much of the Arab world when most of these countries achieve their independence and create modern nation states, is that the state that emerges is a strong state that is very authoritarian, that does not really accept opposition unless it's a loyal opposition, that eliminates opposition or co-opts them when it becomes necessary. And those who can't be co-opted will be eliminated. This was often viewed in some cases, political scientists have talked about many of these Middle Eastern societies as being corporatist states, which is to say that the state essentially brings in all arms of both government, society, banking, transport, and one of the arguments for why this had to be done is that these countries needed to move forward and develop and modernize at a very fast pace. And you couldn't do this if people were wrangling about their political rights or human rights. And in fact, many people in this region of the world were more than willing to give up a certain amount of political rights if they felt their country was going to modernize quickly and their economic boats, all the boats, were going to rise. And this was the promise that many leaders like Nasser and others made. Give me a chance, I will show you what we can do if we work together, if we allow the state to more or less push this forward, and if you all are loyal citizens, of course, don't oppose me, we will do this, and we will gain very quickly, and you'll see how quickly we rise to the level of the West, and we will be competing against the West in no time at all. Of course, it didn't work out quite that way. But before it doesn't work out quite that way, Hassan al-Banna, because of a lot of political violence in Egypt, was assassinated in 1949. We don't need to go through all the details here, but what I want to get to is the fact that for the most part, the Society of Muslim Brothers was trying to work, even though it had greater ideals that were kind of transnational and that were trying to unify Muslims around the world. They were operating in a particular national space, and they were arguing for a particular kind of modernization plan. And as long as they were free to kind of engage and participate and preach and teach and try to convince citizens, they remained fairly moderate. And I say fairly because many of the political factions at this time were not necessarily what you could call nonviolent, and there was a lot of street violence and protests that happened, not just among the Muslim Brothers, but among other groups too. This was people trying to express politics in a kind of environment where people had not normally been able to participate. The colonizers had kept check on all this stuff. They didn't allow a lot of politicking, or they controlled it. And so in the 40s and 50s, this kind of opened up, and people in Egypt and elsewhere began expressing themselves in other ways. In 1952, when the revolution happened, one group of military officers kind of imposed themselves on the society and decided to take it in a particular direction. And the brothers wound up in that mix, getting shunted to the side, and in fact, not just shunted to the side, but as the government of Egypt canceled any other political party, it also wound up over time, after 2 years, by 1954, it also declared the Society of Muslim Brothers an illegal organization. And essentially what it did is declare any kind of oppositional politics as illegal. There would be no opposition, and the government would move forward on its own. And in the aftermath of this, there was, some people say, and this is argued historically, there was an assassination attempt by a lone Muslim Brotherhood gunman against Nasser. Nasser uses it as a pretext both to crack down on the group, arrest hundreds of people, and one of the people who was caught up in this mix is the Muslim Brother ideologue by the name of Sayyid Qutb. And from the mid-1950s on, what we see is a transformation of Islamism that occurs in the prisons of Egypt, where Islamists start to have very, very serious debates about whether the society can be transformed by peaceful means, by preaching, teaching, and outreach, or people must resort to violence. This is a debate that's actually happening among Muslim brothers. We have a lot of biographical, autobiographical information that talks about these kind of debates that were taking place. Among these debaters was Sayyid Qutb, who was in fact a leader of the Muslim Brothers, and while he was in prison, he penned a book that became kind of the primer for militant radical Islam that wound up being translated into many languages and wound up informing many radicals, not just Arabs, not just Egyptians, not just Arabs, but Muslims around the world. This book in its translated form is called Milestones, or Signposts Along the Road. It's been translated many times into English also. And essentially what Sayyid Qutb argues is that true Muslims cannot live true Muslim lives in places like Egypt, and that the reason that they cannot is that the leadership has essentially, the secular leadership has essentially become apostates against Islam. They've turned away from Islam, and they have become more Western than anything else, and that the only way to transform society now is through violence. And he was the person who more or less gave the, I guess what you could say, who provided a very convincing argument to many for why it would be permissible to wage jihad against fellow Muslims, primarily because they're no longer fellow Muslims, because of their behavior. And one of these behaviors that Sayyid Qutb experienced directly was the torture at the hands of fellow Arabs, fellow Egyptians within prison. This was a well-documented cases of Muslim brothers being tortured, very badly tortured. And in fact, there was a genre in the 1970s of prison literature that talked about this kind of torture, and it was very horrendous. But this is where it's within this kind of hothouse environment of the prison, of the debating, and the torture, that what happens is that Islamism in Egypt takes a diametrically opposite kind of, there's oppositional voices here. One voice becomes very militant, another voice stays or decides that moderation is the only way to work, because the modern state in places like Egypt, the modern Arab state, is very, very authoritarian. It's a militarized state. It's a police state that controls the civil society square, and it's very hard for movements like the Muslim Brotherhood to be able to even operate. So the moderates more or less make their peace with this and decide that the best way for Islamism to have a chance is to work within whatever limited civil society space these authoritarian governments are willing to give. And typically that space is a space for philanthropic outreach, for social services, but it's not a political space. All right? So, and the split that more or less occurs is that the Society of Muslim Brothers becomes a more moderate group and defines itself as moderate. It still has goals of creating a modern political reality that is in opposition to the reality that's in Egypt. That's its goal. But it decides that the best way to try to push for this is by publishing magazines and books, and also by working with citizens to provide them with the necessary services that the state doesn't always provide. And another group, following the kind of Qutb line, becomes more militant, and what happens is you find a lot of split-off groups from the Muslim Brothers that emerge that define themselves over and against the moderates and essentially say that the only way to solve the problem in a place like modern Egypt is by violence. And a lot of violent groups, a series of these violent groups emerge in Egypt in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the most prominent of which was the Jihad group, which assassinated President Anwar Sadat in 1981. Now, why am I going through all this? It seems like a history of Islamism when really what we're talking about is ISIS. But in fact, it is out of the militant group of people of militant Islamists, both in Egypt and elsewhere, who wind up with this kind of strange historical event that occurs in Afghanistan, where you have the Soviet invasion, and then you have Muslims from around the world seeing the Soviet invasion as an opportunity to come and to actually wage jihad against a Western oppressor who's oppressing fellow Muslims. And you find militants from a variety of countries wind up making their way to Afghanistan. And many of these countries throughout the Middle East were more than happy to see their militants leave because they were doing nothing more than creating problems in their own country. So what we have is a kind of militant Islamism that was located in nation states that winds up going global in a kind of context where you had a country that was essentially in chaos in Afghanistan because of the war and because of the occupation of the Soviets. And then you had this jihadist organization, these various jihadist groups that were actually being funded by the CIA, being funded by the Saudis, to try, because this was a kind of proxy war for the US to go after the Soviet Union. This went very well. The people won. The Islamists who were coming from a variety of countries, they got good training on the battlefield in many cases. But after the war was over, the question is what happens? Many of these people went home. They returned to their lives. But another group of people stayed on, and those people are who created what we would know as global jihadism, and that is al-Qaeda. Bin Laden, and then his second in command, Zawahiri. It's important to mention Zawahiri here because he's actually an Egyptian medical doctor by training who wound up going to Afghanistan to serve in the jihad, and it was there that he and Osama bin Laden met up to create later on this organization. So here's an example of, in the case of Zawahiri, of a radicalized Islamist from Egypt who makes his way to Afghanistan, bin Laden, a radicalized Islamist from Saudi Arabia who makes his way to Afghanistan, like many others, and it's there that this kind of global jihadism takes root. Now, the reason that this is important is because the focus of global jihadists changes dramatically from the Islamism that was in existence in various nation states. Most Islamist movements, even Society of Muslim Brotherhood groups that rose up in Syria, in Palestine, were mainly focused on changing the political dynamics of their particular nation states. So they were operating within local politics. These were local people who were operating in local politics despite the fact that some of their ideology was more global, and they wanted to create a larger Islamic state. But they were operating locally. And when the people turned militant in these initially, they were directing their militancy not towards the West, not outside, but they were directing their militancy, as Sayyid Qutb argued, towards the apostate Muslim rulers who had turned away from the truth. So this became a debating point of whether you direct your ire and your anger and your hatred and your violence towards the near enemy, in this case it would be the leaders of Egypt, or whether you direct your anger and violence towards the far enemy, and that would be the West. And what global jihadists did in Afghanistan, once everything settled down from the Afghan war, was to take this on a global level, and they were no longer worried about Muslim politics in Muslim countries as much as they were worried about directing and kind of provoking the West into a kind of global war of some kind. And that meant attacking the West in its home territory. But what's interesting about this is that they were not really interested in transforming the political reality on the ground, the social reality, the socioeconomic reality on the ground of Muslim people in Muslim majority countries. In other words, they weren't operating within national politics. They were working outside of a political sphere, because Afghanistan was essentially depoliticized. And this group had no loyalty to Afghanistan, to anything. They weren't trying to create a nation state. They were simply a jihadist movement that was bent on violence and kind of creating chaos. And they did a very good job of it. It's this background where ISIS comes out of, okay? And it's this connective tissue to Islamism where I think, at least for my part, ISIS takes on meaning. So ISIS kind of has a history which starts post-Afghanistan, which starts with the Iraq War of 2003, but its genealogy, that is its deeper history and its sources, go much further to a kind of Islamist origins. So the immediate history that you could say that with the rise of ISIS occurs in Iraq when a man by the name of Musab al-Zarqawi makes his way there, first in 1999. He had initially been in, he was a Jordanian jihadist. He had been actually in Afghanistan running a training camp for jihadists that was actually competing with Osama bin Laden. He then in 1999 transfers to Iraq, starts up another organization, but by 2003 he renames his organization and he becomes essentially the leader of what becomes called as al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay? This is an important thing. This is one of the many examples of the way that al-Qaeda essentially transforms itself, rebrands itself, and spreads its message by people who have one organization simply renaming it and getting other kinds of followers, and it seems like a different kind of organization that has tentacles everywhere. Zarqawi was never very loyal to Osama bin Laden, or for that matter to Zawahiri. In fact, Zawahiri wrote him a very critical letter in 2005 condemning him for some of his activities, the violence that he had been fomenting. He was actually too violent, too brutal, even for al-Qaeda, interestingly enough. But the timing of this is perfect because, if many of you remember, that 2003 is also the start of the Iraq War. So essentially, al-Qaeda in Iraq starts just before the U.S. invasion. And what they wind up doing is creating chaos in Iraq for the Americans who come in there to try to liberate the country in the war on terror. We don't have to go into the justifications of this and all the problematic of that. But Zarqawi this was like an open invitation. It was almost like you didn't have to go to the West anymore. The West was coming to you, so you could attack them on the ground that they were in. And they were occupying a Muslim country, so this was perfect justification for attacking not just Americans, not just Westerners, but also anybody in Iraq who was siding with them. By 2006, he is taken out. The U.S. kill him. They kill him in an attack. Another two people actually take up. This is kind of like the mutations of the group. Ayyub al-Masri takes over, renames the group the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006. He is not going to be in there very long either. And by 2006, the U.S. is actually beefing up its presence. They're actually, for some of you might remember this, that the U.S., in order to fight the jihadists there, wound up trying to bring in some of the Sunni tribal groups. It was called the Awakening. There was kind of an awakening council. They were trying to bring in these Sunnis to fight fellow Sunnis, and these other Sunnis would have been the jihadists. The jihadists themselves, like Islamic State of Iraq and before him al-Zarqawi, was actually operating through a kind of sectarian politics, trying to divide Iraq by attacking Shia, and then having Shia who would respond with militant Shia groups responding to this by attacking Sunnis. again, we don't have time to go into a lot of this, but some of you might remember that one of the first things that the U.S. did when it went into Iraq was to disband the Iraqi army, which was primarily Sunni, and they were affiliated with the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. So they essentially decommissioned the army. So many of the people who were in the army who were Sunnis, very well trained for that matter, were out of a job. And the U.S., in trying to restore what you might consider some political legitimacy for the majoritarian group in Iraq, which is the Shia, who are more numerous, far more numerous than the Sunnis in Iraq. The Shia begin to be empowered, and they begin to be empowered at the expense of the Sunnis, primarily because the Shia who are coming into power view the Sunnis as part of the past Saddam Hussein regime, part of the Ba'athists, who were these brutal people who were supposed to be pushed out to begin with. So what we have is Iraq, which had been held together by a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein, who was bringing various factions together with a strong hand, Sunnis, Shia, and the Kurds. What you now have in 2003 and on with the U.S. there is a kind of factionalism and identity politics that is made even worse by both the activities of radical groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and others who are pushing sectarianism in order to push chaos, and then even the Shia who are being empowered who begin to attack Sunnis because they're worried about the Ba'athists coming back into power. So it's a nightmare, really. The good thing is, of course, and there are good parts of this, is that they do get a handle on this group, Islamic State of Iraq. They do wind up eliminating al-Qaeda to a very large extent. And by 2011, when the U.S. is pulling out, it feels pretty good about this because it's got a new government. There was an election. Not surprisingly, a Shia was elected because they're the majoritarian group. So the Shia essentially come into power by legitimate means, by an actual democratic election. But also not surprisingly, once they get into power, they want to empower the Shia, often at the expense of the Sunni. And now it's been justified by free and fair elections, which is, by the way, one reason why some people would say that the way to actually democratize the Middle East and many of these countries is not through elections, but through coalition governments, because elections merely put the most powerful in.
Yeah. Dr. Kenney, you invited questions during your talk on the topic of free elections. Grant Hale, class of '99, who, by the way, lived abroad in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania and I believe in Afghanistan for a while, writes in to ask, how compatible is Islam with democracy, and can the modern nation-state coexist with the rule of religious law?
I'm not sure if there is an answer to that one. I'm not going to. I'll answer it as an academic and not as a believer. I think many Muslims would say, of course, it's compatible with democracy. There's no reason why it can't be, but it's a matter of getting the right political mix, the right political structures in place to allow people to operate, and that's been a lot of the problems in the Middle East. One can turn to any number of other Muslim countries. Very, very far removed from the Arab world, Indonesia, Malaysia, where they have rather vibrant democracies, and these are Muslim-majority countries. So I don't think this is really a matter of whether Islam is compatible. I think that what's happening currently in the Middle East is a particular historical problem that has emerged there. It does have a religious connection, but primarily because of the religious politics that has been embedded in the modernization process. And it's not just by Islamists, it's not just by al-Qaeda, it's not just by ISIS. It's also by secular rulers who manipulate religion to empower themselves. So this is not, this is a politics that's essentially people who have been using religion for a variety of reasons, often quite cynically. Okay. I just want to return to the idea of the U.S. pulling out in 2011. Maliki, Nouri al-Maliki is in power. A Shia who is in power, and at the same time that essentially he comes in, we also have another transformation in this group, again, mainly because the U.S. kills one of the leaders of one of the jihadist groups, and another person takes his place. The particular person who takes over in 2011, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would eventually declare himself the emir and would declare the caliphate, had actually, and you can see in the photo in the lower left here, he actually had been in an American prison in Iraq for a good number of years, taken prisoner in one of the raids. He was carrying out various operations there, and he was imprisoned. And then when he got out, he more or less transformed himself and the movement. And what was the Islamic State of Iraq winds up becoming the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. Sham meaning what some people would call the Levant, some people would call Greater Syria. He creates this, and he creates it out of the chaos of another state that goes chaotic as a result of the Arab Spring. So the Sunnis who are on the warpath in Iraq, because the Shias have now been empowered and are essentially disenfranchising the Sunnis, they're angry. And then what happens is the Arab Spring turns Syria into chaos, and the Sunni majority there, which is a majority in Syria, not necessarily in Iraq, the Sunni majority there is angry at the Shia regime that was in power, that was actually keeping them out. And what you have is a Sunni empowerment in Syria that winds up fusing with the Sunni empowerment in Iraq, and you have this organization that winds up taking advantage and fusing these things together. So essentially what you had is sectarian politics that existed since the very creation of these nation states, with Sunni Shia numbers, and then the identity politics being ratcheted up, and what you have is an organization, and by the way, this organization is incredibly opportunistic, they're incredibly smart, they're prepared to switch on a dime and change their rhetoric whenever is necessary. This guy is incredibly, he just decided that, well, I might as well go for it. So he winds up creating this unified organization and then declaring himself something that al-Qaeda never thought would actually happen in the lifetime of Osama bin Laden or Zawahiri, and that is the actual creation of an Islamic State, which they were holding off on, thinking that there had to be far more transformation in the Muslim world, far more activism in the Muslim world. So they thought that this was going to come in the how distant future, no one really quite knows. But once this guy does this, he essentially enrages Zawahiri and al-Qaeda because he's now competing with them, which is exactly what these jihadists are doing in various parts of the world. He's declaring himself essentially the center of the jihadist universe, and he is calling Muslims from around the world to obedience to give him the sign or the indication that he is in fact the chosen emir. And with this, he's more or less trying to mimic the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad and other caliphs throughout Islamic history. But again, it's important to understand that what he's doing is playing on initially the kind of ethnic and religious diversity that was in Iraq, and then he was playing on the religious and ethnic diversity that was in Turkey. And what you have then is the creation of this border, this cross-border, budding Islamic empire, in which he's claiming to invite Muslims to come in to kind of live their Muslim lives. We've got some other problems going on, of course, because in this same region, we've got regional powers who are pushing this war. We've got Saudi Arabia, which is very anti-Assad, and which is pumping money into various jihadist groups in Iraq and Syria, Sunni groups, because they want to oppose any kind of Iranian Shia influence that gets spread in the area. You have Iran that's now stepped into the mix, and they are also with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're trying to squeeze the Islamists, and they're trying to push a Shia agenda. So you have, and not just do you have a regional conflict, so you have the Iraq problem, you have the Syria problem, they've become fused now. Then you have regional powers trying to influence it. And on top of this, you have proxy wars with the US and the Soviet Union getting involved. We're trying to support anyway, in theory, Saudi Arabia, or they're trying in theory to support us and other groups. And Russia is supporting the Shia, supporting Hezbollah and Iran. So you've got the makings of the perfect storm of chaos, both regionally in these countries, sectarian politics that are splitting everything up, regional powers who really don't give a damn about Iraq or Syria for that matter, who are pushing their own agenda. And the result is, really, I would just say, I have a feeling that it's going to be very, very difficult to put these countries back together. It's almost impossible at this time to do this. And in fact, there are already maps being drawn about what the future will look like, and they've come up with maps, such as this, where you will have a Shia state that is fused, not necessarily fused with, but borders on Iran. You have a Sunni state that crosses over between Iraq and Syria, that joins the Sunnis together, and then you have this Alawite state, and Alawites are a subdivision of Shia within, that's the religious background of Assad and his family. They are a minority Shia sect that has been dominating Syria for a very long time. And this could very easily be something in a strange way. By the way, and then you have the Kurds to the north, who are very, very eager to map up their own territory, and they certainly do not want to be living either under the Sunnis, the Arab Sunnis, make the distinction here, because for the most part Kurds are Sunnis, but they are a different ethnicity. And it's going to be almost impossible now, or it's going to take a lot of pressure to bring these countries back together, and the likelihood is that this Sykes-Picot agreement that in a strange way ISIS was trying to nullify will wind up being nullified anyway, because even if we eliminate, if the coalition powers manage to eliminate IS, what they're not going to be able to eliminate is the chaos in these countries, the lack of political openness, the lack of inclusion, the lack of economic viability, and the sectarian hatreds are going to be around for generations. And it's very, very difficult to see how there's going to be a lot of cooperation between the Shia of Iraq and the Sunni of Iraq, and the Kurds are just as glad that this is not going to happen. But of course, this is going to create its own problems, because if a Kurdish state emerges, Turkey is not going to be very happy. They're already very fearful about this. And so they actually are another regional power that's in the mix, trying to support the Sunnis, and very fearful that the Kurds are going to wind up being empowered in the long run. Okay, I want to go back and just touch very quickly on something, because we did have a very hopeful set of events that happened in 2011 with the Arab Spring. I've already talked about this briefly, how the Arab Spring wound up influencing Syria, with leading to a civil war that wound up, empowering the Sunnis to try to do something and overthrow the Assad regime, this Alawite regime. It looked very, very hopeful in places like Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt, with all these people gathering to throw out Hosni Mubarak, one of the authoritarian rulers. And in fact, I think many of us hoped that the very problems that were embedded in Arab politics, the failures of Arab politics, were going to be addressed as a result of the Arab Spring. And we saw a number of Arab rulers tossed out. They were, if not killed, they were tossed out of power, or they ran. And, well, of course, we all know by now that Hosni Mubarak is still free, is now free, but we don't have to. But it looked good at the time anyway. That within the first couple of years, it looked like the Arab Spring was going to pay off. And now, 4 years later, we have a very, very sad state of affairs. We have a variety of countries where you have, yes, governments overthrown, but essentially we have returned to authoritarian politics. We have a number of countries where you have some kind of civil war going on, certainly in Libya, which now has three wilayat, or three provinces of IS that have taken hold. You have in Egypt the province of Sinai, which has been declared for IS. You have in Yemen, you have chaos there. You have Syria and Iraq, where ISIS is located. So all the hopefulness of the Arab Spring has actually kind of dissipated, except for one country, and that's Tunisia. There is still hope that Tunisia might be able to find its way out. They have had democratic elections several times, and the Islamists there seem to be willing to go along with things, even though they could have been empowered to take office. They stepped down when they realized that some of the more radicalized Islamists were going to ruin things. So Tunisia might find a way to get through this, if for no other reason than to see the kind of political chaos that's happening in other regions, if they take that as a kind of directive. And if we look right now at what's happening in the Arab world, you'll see that there are any number of jihadist attacks and jihadist movements operating. So even after the Arab Spring, you can actually tell that the Arab Spring has become undone by the fact that jihadists have actually won out, because the Arabs, the hopefulness of the Arab Spring, the potential of democracy actually taking hold in some cases, the potential of open societies that seem to be infusing the people and making them go into the streets, that has all since seemingly dissipated. And now what you have is return to authoritarian governments and militarized governments. And there is not, except for Tunisia, a democracy in the Middle East. We don't, and of course I am not even dealing with Israel here, because not that it doesn't count, it counts big time in some ways, but I'm talking about the Arab Muslim world here, not Israel. So it doesn't look very good. And ISIS, well, I'm sure that within the next 6 months, year, if the coalition works, we might see ISIS be decimated, but in some ways it won't really matter. Because if these countries don't find a way to accommodate difference, sectarian difference, ethnic differences, there will always be the idea of ISIS, there will always be the idea of global jihadism, and there will always be a possibility of them returning to this, and there will always be an opening for people who wish to create the chaos that is currently going on. Do we have time here, or no?
Absolutely, we have questions. Are there questions in the house here?
Well,
sure. Professor Bato on the front row here.
Sure.
Thank you. Very informative. One question of information first, and that's what is ISIL? Is that in the Lebanon or Levant?
I decided not to go into the various transliterations and translations of this group. ISIL is another way of translating a sham. A sham is the word that's used that typically people would say it's Syria, but it's Syria before the modern nation states of Syria, when it was Greater Syria, which would have included Lebanon, and some people would say even parts of what's currently Israel. So in Europe, that area is often called Levant. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, you have people who call it, so I think the more accurate thing is to call it a sham, because that's the Arabic word, but it can mean Syria. For some people, it means Levant, because it's more than just the modern state, the modern state of Syria.
Thank you. The real question I want to ask is how, in these various places, are the majority of people reacting? Are they sympathetic, do you think, to ISIS or to the Muslim Brotherhood, or are they more traditional in the sense of going back to an older form of Islam?
Well, right now, and I think this is the other danger, is that the Muslim Brotherhood is on the run. It's been declared a terrorist organization in Egypt. Its properties are being confiscated. Its leadership is in jail, often, and many of them have already been condemned to death. And what people weren't rounded up were on the run. And Saudi Arabia has now also turned against the Society of Muslim Brothers, a group that it, at one point in time, welcomed in. Now it's cracked down on them. And a number of the Gulf countries are doing the same thing. And personally, I find this to be incredibly problematic, because while I'm not a big fan of Islamism, I don't think it's going to work, and I think it's too vague and ill-defined. But it is an idea, it's an ideal that many Muslims hold on to, mainly because of the inabilities of modern nation states to address their needs. So many people have relied on religion and these kinds of religious ideas to cast themselves over and against something that they know is corrupt, right? There's a lot of crony capitalism throughout the Middle East, and it's based on the elites. Sometimes these are sectarian elites, sometimes they're elites based on connections with the military. But at least Islamism in its moderate form had made peace with the modern state and was willing to work through the modern state. And the example of this is that many of these groups, these Islamist groups, whether the Society of Muslim Brothers or others, had stood for elections. And in fact, post-Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood wins a democratic election. Now, personally, I don't think they should have gone to democratic elections, not open elections. I think they should have formed a coalition government, but they went to open elections. The Society of Muslim Brothers clearly won. There's no doubt about that. No one doubts it. They were the only well-organized political unit in the country, so it's no doubt, there's no reason why they wouldn't have won. And of course, they blew it in a sense because what they simply did was they adopted the same kind of authoritarianism that was in place before. The difference is, at least they were authorized by the vote. They legitimately won, and they were trying to push their policies. If they were smart, they might have tried to form a more coalition government, but they knew that they had been oppressed for so many decades that they were going to try to do what they wanted to do. And that's the problem, I think, with many of the democratic elections that are taking place in these kind of countries, is that it's a winner-take-all election. And once they win, they take it as a mandate to do what they want. And these countries are not, with all due respect, they're not politically, in a political, cultural way, they're not mature enough. People are not ready for this yet. And I think many people in the Middle East would admit this. They're not prepared for this. They need time to transition, but many of these governments, either because they want the Islamists to fail, and I think that was in the cards. There's no way the military rulers were going to allow the Society of Muslim Brothers to win. Eventually, they were always going to take them out in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I'm convinced of that. Whether they made mistakes or not, they were going to go out. But there's got to be a way to try to bring these people into the system. There's got to be a way to find some kind of inclusive politics that allows these ideas to kind of play themselves out and fail to work. And if you cannot do that, if you can't overcome these political differences in a kind of open political dialogue, in an open political space, and yes, it's going to be nasty, but if you can't do that, these ideas are always going to stand in the background as options, right? They're always going to be there as an option, and what's going to wind up happening is the moderates are going to become, over time, militant. And we see this even right now in Egypt. There has been some inklings already that the Muslim Brotherhood, who had committed to moderation, and they had maintained moderation even after the crackdown on them in the jail sentences, and the attempt to sentence them to death, even though they haven't been carried out yet, they tried to remain moderate. And now you find many of the young people are pushing against the elders that we've got to fight back. And you could very easily see, I don't think that they would wind up joining ISIS, but you could very easily see some of these people wind up joining other groups to try to attack the Egyptian state. Because how long do you allow the state to essentially suppress you, oppress you, without fighting back? And I think the youth in the Muslim Brotherhood are asking their leaders the same question. The West isn't going to come to your rescue. The West is not interested in Islamism. They're not interested in seeing it win. And if we don't do something ourselves, but now with the Egyptian state cracking down, the Gulf states cracking down, and with Saudi Arabia cracking down on these, I think it's a recipe for more volatility and more transformation of people who would otherwise be moderate and willing to participate in the political process, who are going to try alternative means, and that means violence.
One of our online webinar viewers, Joe Ross, class of '84 in Cincinnati, writes that United Arab Emirates is a tourist and business center for the Middle East. Qatar will be holding the World Cup in 2022. Will these models hold up, he asks?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, having visited the UAE, specifically Dubai, I have to say that I don't really view Dubai or places like Dubai, and I don't mean this as any insult to the UAE. It's almost like it's an Arab Disneyland. This is not the real Middle East. Now, maybe it's the alternative Middle East that people would like to see it transformed into, but I don't think it's realistic. The rest of the Muslim world, the Arab Muslim world, is not going to become a shopping center, right? This is not going to happen. So while these are viable options, while this is a reality, this is one area of the Arab world that seems to be a positive light. It is not certainly a model for what's going to be able to transform the rest of the Arab world. And I think, I'm not going to say they're anomalous. They've managed to carve themselves out a reality that's working for them, at least financially. But they're also very, very careful about cracking down on Islamists of any kind. And we don't want to confuse what's happening with a kind of very positive, it's almost like China in capitalism. They've adopted a kind of capitalist system, but they're keeping very close control of the society and the politics. And how long is that going to work? Well, if everyone's happy economically, it could work for quite some time. But as people get a little bit more politically sophisticated and as things maybe take a turn in another direction, it could be that people in these countries decide that even this isn't enough. So.
Yes, hi, I'm Matt Mischoli, and I'll first say hello to my friend Joe in Cincinnati. Probably 5 or 6 slides ago, you showed a slide where the Middle East is broken up along the lines of religious or ethnic distinctions. I'm just curious, how realistic do you think that is in the foreseeable future, even several decades from now? Is this realistic, or is this more just hopeful and idealistic?
One could argue that it's already happened in terms of the reality on the ground. The Sunnis of Syria, the Sunnis of Iraq already have more in common right now, unfortunately, one might argue, than they do with the Shia who are in their own country, right? So, granted, we do not have new nation states that have emerged, right? But what we have are old nation states which have fallen apart, and they've fallen apart along sectarian and ethnic lines, right? So, whether this happens in the near future in terms of will we have a new United Nations mandate for the creation of new states, that is a long time off, I think. And part of it's a long time off is because the surrounding states would probably be a bit concerned about the fallout, and especially a country like Turkey is going to be very worried about the fallout. But it's not clear that this wouldn't be a better option, given the difficulties that it's going to that they're all going to encounter. Iraq's going to have incredible difficulties putting these factions together. And I think there's already signs that with the displacement of people, that Sunnis are leaving Shia majority areas, and people, Baghdad is kind of a mixed area, but because Baghdad is the capital and it's Shia dominated and it's now being enforced and helped by both Iran and, strangely, us in our own way. For those of you who might have seen the stories recently on the news just last week, there was reporting going on in the Kurdish region where people were saying, why is the U.S. failing to supply weapons, more high-tech weapons, to the Kurds who are in fact trying to fight IS or ISIS? Why aren't we doing it? Because right now we're being deferential to the central government in Baghdad, which is worried that if the Kurds get more and more empowered and more militarily armed, they will easily just say, we're no longer going to answer to Baghdad. So without the U.S. doing this, I mean, so this is the kind of politics that's at work. The Kurds are more than willing, they're trying to move into areas that Saddam Hussein had moved Sunnis into to try to change the dominance of Kurds. They're trying to move Kurds back in and push the Sunnis out. So this is everyone has reverted to the kind of identity politics and sectarianism where they feel empowered because everyone else is. And once this starts, and once the killing starts, and it's already started, it's going to be hard to undo this. You need to have some kind of trust to build an inclusive state. And right now, no one trusts each other. And it's hard to see when they're going to start. And we can't build that. This is the thing. We might be able to go in and wipe out ISIS. We and our coalition partners might be able to eliminate ISIS. We cannot create polities. The people on the ground need to do that. They need to find ways to live together. And it might be that in some places in regions like this, most other, by the way, I should say, most other Arab nation states are not as problematic in terms of their sectarian divisions and their ethnicity. Lebanon had its own history from 75 on for around 15 or 20 years. It went through its own very bloody sectarian wars. They're over it now, ideally, and they're doing everything they can not to get drawn back into this. Because they were part of Greater Syria, they have their own problems. So this is a peculiar problem, and I'm not so sure it wouldn't be better resolved, like Yugoslavia was better resolved by people, you know. Once this starts, you don't have a Tito to put it together, to hold it together as a strong arm. It might be best to have these people go their separate political ways and find a way to live as neighbors, neighbors with borders as opposed to next-door neighbors.
We have a number of questions streaming in from our webinar participants now. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly try to work through several. The next is from Meher Makta, class of 2010 from Michigan. How do you think ISIS might impact Muslims in other parts of the world, particularly Pakistan?
Well, hello to Meher. She's an ex-student of mine.
Yeah.
Well, I should say, I have some slides here about, there's protests going on in various parts, there have been protests in various parts of the Muslim world against ISIS, but there's also been signs of support, to be quite honest, because the idea of Islamist politics is around the Muslim world. There you find Islamist politics everywhere. So you do find supporters of this. Not necessarily supporters who are going to pick up and change their lives and move to this region and become jihadists, but you do have people who at least vicariously will support it. I think for the most part, most countries now are so defensive about this, especially any borderline countries, that they're really, really trying to control any kind of cross-border ISIS incursions. Jordan was doing it before. Now with the execution of the pilot, they're even more worked up. But to be quite honest, getting worked up and getting people into the street for protest is not what's going to eliminate the idea of ISIS. You might work up enough anger and protest to go after them, to attack them, and to eliminate them militarily. But the very idea of ISIS means the transformation of everyday politics in the Middle East as a whole. And there's no sense that there is enough movement towards that. Certainly not among the leadership, which is very well entrenched and that have very strong control over their societies and are preventing these kinds of transformations. I just don't see that happening.
Kelly Stone, class of 2009, asks, what should Western policy toward the Arab Muslim world be going forward, considering that volatility is, of course, an undesirable outcome, and that most Western policymakers are uncomfortable with Islamism?
Yes, we are uncomfortable with Islamism. We cannot have a U.S. policy that imposes or empowers Islamism. That's something that has to happen in these countries, or it's something that should be allowed to happen in these countries. The difficulty is that we have historically been in bed with authoritarian rulers who have used the idea of Islamism as a tool to get more money and more arms from us so they can crack down on their own people. And once 9/11 happened and the war on terror began, they could milk this even more. So the attempt now to cast the Society of Muslim Brothers and ISIS as part of a larger, ball of terrorist problems is the very thing that, in some cases, some of these political leaders want to do. I think it's really creating more gray than anything else, but that's the whole point, is that they want to be continued to be supported in order to stay in power. They know Islamism is a direct political threat to their power. They know if there is an open election in many of these countries, the Islamists will at least win part of this. and they will be empowered, and many of these rulers are not wanting this to happen. They will not. They don't want it to happen. What should we do? I don't know what we should do. But one thing's for sure, any time that we get involved, people are going to get killed, and we get blamed. We get blamed for the chaos, and rightly so. You'll remember Colin Powell's very apt remark as a result of the invasion of Iraq. When you break it, you bought it, and we have bought these problems. We didn't create them. We didn't create Islamist politics. We didn't create authoritarian rule. We didn't create the lack of inclusiveness. We didn't create sectarianism and the Sunni-Shia division. But we are up to our eyeballs in it now. And we have been involved with leadership groups in Saudi Arabia. By the way, Saudi Arabia's policy with promoting sectarianism, anti-Shia hatred, anti-Christian hatred for that matter, the textbooks are it's terrible. What they're doing, what they're promoting in Syria right now with the jihadists is exactly what they're trying to prevent at home. This is, the cynical nature of a lot of this is terrible. We are going to come out losers no matter what. Just give you a little anecdote. I used to have and I know that Nafat Nasser, if he was here, he wouldn't want me to say this, but I used to have a Lebanese political science professor at American University in Cairo who typically said, you know, the problem with the Middle East is that every time we go to war, the West steps in and solves it for us. Maybe it would be better if we just battled it out amongst ourselves, let us redraw our own borders, and you guys stay out. Now, of course, that's this kind of what-if scenario. It's very difficult to see how that's going to happen because, well, one could say cynically, oil. But also, it's very difficult to stand by when your allies are asking you to step in for assistance and aid. But at some point, the U.S. has to figure out that attention to yourself and to provoke, and that's what they're doing.
Okay. I'm going to give our last question to one of our students here tonight.
Hello, I'm Allison Schultz. I had a question about what you think the future of Islamic extremism will be, like the evolution of it after IS, especially if IS was defeated.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. I don't think it's going away. You can kill Osama bin Laden. We have not managed to track down Zawahiri yet. People assume he's still alive. He sends out messages every once in a while. But I think it's important to realize that groups like al-Qaeda, groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq, groups like ISIS, these are more ideals and ideas than they are anything else. And I think it's very, very difficult to kill the idea when you don't have much of an alternative. So in many of these countries, whatever form it might take, and it might not be overly sophisticated, I mean, the sad thing is that these people are, because of the media aspect of all this never even happened under al-Qaeda that much, but now it's happening with ISIS. The media aspect of this is allowing people to turn on to this no matter where the hell they are. They can, and these people have no real idea in some cases about what Islam is. They have no Islamic training. In some cases, they've never been to the Middle East, but they get the notion. They're angry with their own lives, and we see these individual lone wolves who are now, in some way, affiliating themselves with something that really they have no idea what the affiliation means. And by the way, it's not even really clear what affiliation means for people on the ground. These are not. I mean, ISIS is not a real state, right? I mean, it's a pseudo state. It's a rump state that probably doesn't have a very long life in front of it. But whatever happens after this is that I think you can be sure that if the Middle East politics continues in the current strain, you're going to have some other form. And this is going to pop up other places, and there are lots of places for it to pop up. I wish I could say that there weren't, but I think there are. I think this might, by the way, I think this could have been staunched quite a bit. I mean, to be honest, I think you're always going to have militant Islamism. That is a problem in the Middle East. That's a problem in the Muslim world that's going to continue for decades. There's always going to be some element of it. It's going to be something that people can fall back to or fall back on. But you could have eliminated a lot of this and the potential for a lot of it if the Arab Spring would have turned out differently.
Well, on behalf of more than 70 alumni across the country and the world, I think, who tuned in tonight, I want to thank Dr. Kenney for obviously an insightful discourse over the last hour and a half here in Greencastle. We're much better informed about this critical world series of events, and we're grateful to you for the perspective. Also want to remind all of our alumni online that the next session in the Virtual Alumni College will be March 30th with art historian Ann Harris, who will be speaking on the topic Decoding Charlie Hebdo, the Origins and Cultural Perceptions of Caricature. That will be March 30th at 8 p.m. I also welcome our live attendees to come back with us Watson Forum that night. But with that, I want to thank Dr. Kenney again and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.